I love Persona 3. It was the game that got me into the Persona series, with an amazing cast of characters, an all-star soundtrack that in my opinion has yet to be beaten, and a story that, while a little backloaded, culminates in one of my favorite video game endings of all time. It is my favorite Persona game, but I can't say it's the best Persona game, even if it's just my own opinion we're considering. Some of you might already know this, but Persona 3 Reload came out around this time last year, and as a big fan of the original, I simply had to play it. I thought I'd give my impressions of the game along with the usual end-of-year wrap-up that most content creators like to do, but when I really thought about it, what I wanted to say about Persona 3 Reload vastly dwarfed what I had to say about any of the other games I'd played. So I decided to just make a video with it as the focus instead. Anyway, I've played through the game completely. I loved it. It was probably the best that I could have expected from a Persona 3 remake, but if I'm honest, I still couldn't bring myself to say that it's the best Persona game even now. You need to understand Persona 3's place in history if you want to understand where I'm coming from. It was the first of its kind for Atlus, fusing dating sim and role-playing mechanics in a way that hadn't really been done before. They were treading unexplored grounds, and as a result, Persona 3 as a game was really an experimental prototype that needed to be refined through re-releases and sequels. The distance between Persona 3 and 5 in terms of gameplay mechanics is vast, and anyone who's gone back to playing Persona 3 after playing Persona 5 Royal can feel it. A good example of Persona 3's prototype nature can be seen in the social link system. Later games would refine this system so that players had more incentive to engage with the mechanic. But in Persona 3, social links were a lot simpler. They had no benefits aside from boosting your fusion experience, and a lot of the dialogue and dialogue choices were very bare bones. If you ask me, I think the reason the social links were so unrefined were because the developers didn't think fans of the previous games would engage with the new mechanics much. It was sort of out of the way, so that if players wanted to ignore it, then they could. I think this is also why Persona 3 is the only game where you can get locked into a romance with no option to be friends instead. They probably didn't think most players would even want to max out all of the social links. They probably assumed most players would just pick the girl they liked and ignore the rest. It's certainly a mistaken assumption, but it's not an unreasonable one. Ultimately, this all means that when Persona 3 Reload got revealed, I had a lot of expectations for it. I've always loved Persona 3, but I can't deny that Persona 5 is a better game. Persona 3 may have better music, aesthetics, characters, and story, but Persona 5 isn't a slouch in any of those areas at all. Meanwhile, Persona 5 absolutely trounces Persona 3 in gameplay, with a refined and robust version of the game system initially introduced in the latter. I've never really shied away from saying that Persona 5 Royal is the best game in the series. But in the back of my mind, I've always wanted to put Persona 3 in that position instead. Most other times, I would have no qualm saying that my favorite game in the series is also the best. But that's not the case for Persona 3. I could just say it. No one really has to know how I feel inside. But I know that I don't really believe it. So Persona 3 Reload was a chance for a version of the game that I could put up as my personal best Persona game with no caveats. Unfortunately, after having beaten the game and after letting that experience marinate for about a year, and as well as having watched other people play through it as well, I have to say that Reload ended up missing the mark. Don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic game, and it's got a lot of great improvements and additions that add to the original experience. Theurgies are a fun addition to combat, and Tartarus got a lot of stuff that attempted to lessen the tedium of dungeon crawling. To me, though, these additions did little to raise the game to the level of masterpiece. I'm sure many people have their own ideas for why Persona 3 Reload could not be called a masterpiece, but for me, the biggest reason is that it is simply too faithful to its original. You have to remember, Persona 3 first came out in 2006, with all of the limitations of that era. While Persona 3 Reload certainly shows huge leaps in graphical upgrades, gameplay additions, and quality of life changes, it can't help but feel like a gussied up 2006 game, which makes it feel meek in the context of 2024. The main reason it feels this way is because the core of the game, its structure and plot, is largely untouched from how it was when it first released. Now, it's natural for Atlus to try and deliver a faithful remake. After all, that's how most fans want their remakes to be. But as I've said before, Persona 3 was essentially an experimental prototype. And with so much of its original structure preserved, a lot of the clunkiness and jank born from that experimental system came along with it. They did their best to refine it, yes, but at the end of the day, most of Persona 3's problems are problems that cannot be fixed without a complete up-down revamp. Tartarus cannot be fixed from being a boring dungeon crawl without a complete revamp. Social link conversations, a number of which are hilariously basic when compared to more contemporary entries, cannot be improved without huge script rewrites. At the end of the day, Persona 3 Reload's changes are just too insignificant to move the dial. Now, there's plenty of problems with Persona 5 Royal too. I think the story in Persona 5 overall has a lot of pitfalls, although it's still enjoyable overall. I think that while Persona 5 Royal did a lot to refine the original's game system, they sort of forgot to tune up the difficulty, which made it hard to really appreciate some of the more ridiculous things you could make in that Velvet Room. But at the end of the day, Persona 5 Royal is still one of the best packages Atlus has put out when it comes to gameplay, music, and presentation. They did their best with Persona 3 Reload, but their dedication to being faithful ended up undoing them, because a gussied up 2006 game isn't going to beat a game that came out in 2019. I know that not many people really care about the fact that Persona 3 is not perceivably better than Persona 5. I know even less care about the fact that I can't justify calling Persona 3 Reload the best Persona game. I'm sure some people will just tell me to say that it is anyway, but I can't do that. I can't because in my heart, I know I don't feel that way. As much as I love the game, I can't ignore its faults, no matter how tired I am of having to drop caveats whenever I say it's my favorite game. And at the end of the day, if I can't be true to my own feelings, what else do I really have? Thanks for watching. Persona 3 genuinely does have a special place in my heart, as it was probably the one game that really pulled me back into video games and JRPGs in a big way during a part of my life when I wasn't really playing games all that much. It's important to me, but I have to admit that it's not as good as it could be. Still, I love Persona 3 and Persona 3 Reload, and I'm happy to take what I've already got. But what do you guys think? Do you think Persona 3 Reload deserves to be considered the best despite its flaws? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you want to catch more of my videos, and I'll see you next time.